Hello, everyone. Welcome to another issue of the Power Mindset Interview Series. I'm Jeff, and today we have our friend Sherry, who teaches English Language and Lit, and is a partner of mine in the Teacher Project. Sherry, welcome to the Power Mindset. Please tell everyone
Thank
your
you.
story.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Um, so tell us, Sherry, tell us your story.
Well, I honestly generally find it really hard to talk about myself because I don't do it very often. So reflecting on what I wanted to say today, really it came to mind that it takes a lot of courage to take the space and to assume that you're taking space is going to be welcome. It's something that I'm still dealing with at times. I'm just not used to it. But my story, I come from a very international family, so I've never really been rooted in one place. I'm used to experiencing different locations and meeting different people. And I grew up in LA. I've always loved and been very excited by literature. And I always knew that I wanted a life that engages with it in some way. I didn't really know how, but I've loved studying stories. And Arthurian literature in particular has been a formative part of my life. I did my undergraduate in Arthurian literature and mythopoesis. So I'm very interested in how stories construct the way we perceive ourselves and how they shape the way we understand reality and our relations to each other. So that has really informed a lot of my research moving forward. I did a year of national service at one point, and I opened up after school programs for underprivileged youth as a member of AmeriCorps. And
Wow.
then I went on to MA in English at Clark University in Massachusetts, focusing on American literature. And I actually wrote on Walt Whitman, who
Wow.
in his Leaves of Grass, most people kind of ignore that he has a really small cycle of poems in Leaves of Grass called the Children of Adam cycle. And in this story, or in this poetry collection, I should say, he reimagines the story of Adam and Eve, but takes away original sin. And he considers
Mm,
what that will do uh, if people accept that story as a new American Bible, the ramifications it could have on American mentality and ideas of morality. So
wow, it's
it's
powerful.
really, really interesting. I enjoyed the research tremendously. Um, and he did. He intended Leaves of Grass to be received as a new American Bible. Um, it It changed the way I thought about stories in some capacity, because I started seeing them as flexible things that can be reworked. Um, and I might have understood that conceptually before that, but I didn't understand it in practice before that. So that was a really formative part of my studies, I guess you could say. Clark University also formative at Clark University. I was a teaching assistant there. So that is actually where my teaching career began.
Mm,
Um, and I taught Introduction to Medieval Literature and fiction by women writers. I really enjoyed what I was doing there. And after that degree, I jumped into teaching. So I went back to LA. I taught at Base Yaakov School for Girls. I taught at Notre Dame High School in LA. And there I was teaching AP English Language and AP English Literature. And I really loved my work. I loved my students. I loved the community there. I was there a good 5, 6 years, but something was missing. I always, since I was really little, had this dream of seriously studying Arthurian literature. And so I applied to my two dream schools thinking I'd never get in, right? I was writing letters of reference for my seniors at 2 in the morning on my birthday. And after I finished, I didn't I didn't really think I should go to sleep because I had to be up for work 3 hours later. So I wrote my own letters to my two dream schools, and I got into both. So
Wow.
it was amazing. I didn't expect to. It was more of a, if I don't apply, then I'll never know, but at least I will have known that I applied. Um, but I got in and I was over the moon and scared. And I had something to prove to myself at that point that I could actually go through with it and do it. It was more of a, a personal mission at that point. So I left my job. I moved countries. I pursued a second master's degree or an MPhil, which is a 2-year master's by research at the University of Oxford. And after I finished my degree there, I focused on medieval literature and Arthurian literature at Oxford. And I studied paleography and how to analyze manuscripts, how to date manuscripts, how to trace the ownership history of manuscripts. It was really fascinating work. Um, and I got in for a PhD at Royal Holloway, University of London after that. I didn't anticipate that either, but it happened. So I was staying. I thought initially I was just coming for a couple of years and then going back to LA. And that is how I ended up in the UK long term. I did my PhD in 15th century chivalric texts, and I looked at heraldry and chivalry and constructions of nobility. So, how do we create ideas of what it means to be noble in character, not just in blood? And how does heraldry signify that? So this
Wow.
is something that's been kind of growing. There's a definite thread through my research, but it's run the gamut from American to medieval. But there is a definite thread through it. So the last 2 years of my PhD, sadly, I was diagnosed with cancer. Um, and that was a really difficult thing to go through. Um, and I'm mentioning this because it, it forced me to pivot in ways I never would have imagined. I had a trajectory and I had to rethink my trajectory because my energy levels were just very different after that. And because I needed to figure out, immigration issues to stay in the UK. I needed sponsorship. So I, on a limb, applied to do a maternity cover at Eton College, and I got it. So I taught at Eton College for a year. That was an incredible experience. And the students were very very curious and engaged, and I really enjoyed it. But after that, I did teach at a couple of other schools. They weren't really the best fit for me. They were
Were
good
those
schools,
schools university level or was it a high school?
secondary schools.
Okay.
So it would be like in the UK, year 8 to year 13, which would
Okay.
be the American equivalent of middle and high school.
Okay.
Right. Um, so I did teach at a couple of schools, but it was, COVID hit. Um, it was very heavy workloads, and I was so focused on doing all the things and keeping up with the admin that I felt like the teaching became secondary and I couldn't really focus on the students. So I wasn't very happy, and I decided to pivot. Through all those years, I was also continuing to tutor on the side for extra money, especially over holidays, sometimes on weekends. And with COVID, the demand for that became a lot more intense. So I decided to pivot fully as demand grew and focus on building up my tuition business. And that's basically how I ended up where I'm at now. Um, I really like tutoring because you can see a lot of tangible results. You get to know the students better. You get to individually engage with them and get to know how to help them and get to see their progress in a way that you do when you're in a big classroom. But when you have a class of 30 or 50, you just don't know them at the same level. You don't have the time to give them. So I really like being able to give people individual attention. Um, and that's my story. That's how I ended up where I am.
That's absolutely fascinating. So a couple things I just want I'm curious about. It seems to me the concept of a story is very important to you.
Yes.
From your own story to studying stories, to studying about how stories are constructed, to learning about your students' stories. Could you just talk about that common thread between what the concept of the stories mean to you?
Well, the concept of a story is it's self-expression, ultimately. We create stories to understand ourselves, who we are, our place in the world, our relationship to each other and to the environment, to the cosmos. And so without them, we're kind of unmoored. Um, I think that it's it's really important to teach people, to help people to critically think for themselves and imagine their own stories instead of just accepting the models of stories that have come before. Yes, their own stories will deal with some of the archetypal structures of the models that have come before. But if we only know a certain type of story, it's very difficult to imagine something different if we don't allow ourselves to expand those boundaries.
I I want you to expand on that when we talk about the concept of literature and connect that to your students' development of their own story. How do you see literature? And you could talk about wherever part of your career you want to talk about, from Los Angeles to the UK, secondary, whichever career part or all of it. How do you think the concept of stories help students, young people, anybody develop their character?
Well, having a lot of models to draw from helps you to recognize that you don't have to be one character at all points. Who I was yesterday is not who I am today. And that's not necessarily who I'll be tomorrow. Yes, I'm the same physical person, but looking back at me 10 years ago is a very different me. We are made up of our experiences, but we're also made up of our ambitions and our dreams and our hopes and where we direct ourselves, right? So I think that it's vital for our well-being and for our sense of self and sense of identity, um, that we create stories that nourish our souls and our spirits, not just what we're expected to be doing, right? Um, we become so busy with life that we forget to live it often. And even if we're aware of that, just the way society is set up, the way work is set up, the way schools are set up, there's so much pressure to churn out productivity that we've forgotten how to be still with ourselves. And I think stories remind us to do that.
I totally agree with you. I'm thinking about my daughter's journey through reading, and she had dyslexia. And but she loves stories. She would love to go to the play and see the story. She loved to see movies. She loved to hear my stories from my life. She always says, "Daddy, tell me another story."
Yeah.
And I used to kind of tell her like reading unlocks the potential for even more stories.
Yes.
Do you think that there's a difference in the impact that a story from, let's say, a movie will have than the story from an actual novel?
Absolutely, without a doubt. And I don't mean that in any way to denigrate the stories of films on the stage, the stories you see, but when you're watching a story, whether it's a play or something on screen, there's been a director who's made the decisions for how that's going to be presented, and actors that have made the decisions for how characters are going to sound and appear and engage. Whereas when you're reading, you become the immersive kind of sensory creator. You get to
Mm,
imagine imagine things as you want them. So if a director or if you grew up always seeing a character presented a specific way, it'll be very difficult for you to imagine that character any other way. So if you're only watching films and going to the theater, and I love theater, I'm a huge theater goer, right? I'm in
too,
no
yeah.
way denigrating it, but we have to be cognizant of the fact that we are watching someone else's interpretation of a story, which is great, and we can engage with it, and it will elicit emotions and catharsis from us, and sympathy and empathy and all the things, emotions that we need to feel. Um, but we're depriving ourselves of the experience of the mental agility to envision it for
Mm.
ourselves, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I think that mental agility has a lot of implications in terms of what I always feel like the patience that a book allows you to experience and allowing the story to kind of come to you, right? And allowing your to engage your imagination. It allows, I think that engagement gives you a kind of calmness that you have a chance to kind of be with yourself with this book instead of all these images, flashes, and stuff coming at you. I think like when I recognize it with my daughter, when we read and we do our breathing in the morning, she's a different kid than when we don't if we don't do it that day, right?
That's an
Um, you know that my business is in the power mindset, and my mission is to empower young people with a mindset for allow them to be successful in life. But mindset has a very big, wide definition. I
yes.
want you to define the term, how it means to you, what mindset means to you. How would you define it?
I think there's a lot of different ways one could define mindset. It entails consciously focusing on experiencing something, like actually being in the moment, right? Which is difficult for us to do because oftentimes we're trained to distract ourselves from having to experience the moment. Um, I suppose Milton in Paradise Lost said that, or wrote that the mind is its own place, and in itself it can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. We have that capacity depending on how we interpret things. The same events are up for our interpretation. And that's why reading is important because we learn how to interpret for ourselves, right? I do think it takes a lot of work to do that because our perception of things is going to it's going to have implications for whether we're able to broaden or we contract the way we are with ourselves and in the world. Does that make
It
sense?
makes perfect sense. It's kind of like, from what, if I'm understanding you correctly, to you, mindset is your ability to make sense of the world and kind of giving you the power to do that.
Yeah. So
So
that
let's bring the conversation to how does mindset play out in your world right now as a business owner, as an educator, as the goal for your students? How does mindset and how you define it play out in your professional life right now?
but ebbs and flows. I mean, I have, like everyone, some days where my mindset is stronger than others. I've definitely gone through lows, but I've also gone through points of extreme confidence and highs and knowing I can do something. Ultimately, I know that I am resilient, but there are some days where it's hard to see the light at the end of it, right? Um, so you kind of, I, I had to learn, um, especially these last 5 years, I think, that I can't do everything and that I do need to let go of some things. Much as I would love to do everything, it's too much. You need to be able to focus on something in order to complete it, right? So that has been a big lesson for me, that I conceptually understood but practically did not, um, until really after my diagnosis and my energy level shifts that really had an impact on me. Um, I do think the shift from full-time teaching, whether whatever level, right, in the US, the UK, um, you're talking about a very set schedule, um, with schools, and the shift to teaching, online is going to be, it's required a radical discomfort at some points, um, not just because it's a different mode of teaching, but you engage people differently virtually than you can in person. That in no way suggests that it's better or worse. I do think you have a lot more tools that you can use in both situations that will engage students differently. Um, but I had to become very willing to be uncomfortable because with schools, they find you your students. When you're tutoring full time, you need to learn to find your own students and to balance things, to make sure that all the paperwork that is very different paperwork from just marking papers gets done. And if you don't have that kind of, business school training, it's a huge learning growth curve. Um, so I think that being willing to be uncomfortable and to sit with the mud and, allow myself grace to not get everything right the first time and to trust that it will get better has been a big part of the mindset shift that's been going on.
I want to ask you a question that I haven't asked anyone before, but it just came to me as you're talking. Do you think your experience as an entrepreneur has made you a better teacher?
Absolutely. I think every experience that I've had has in some way made me a better teacher, but a better teacher for whom, right? Every experience you get is going to help you connect with someone else differently, right? Um, I do think that it's challenged me to be a much more flexible teacher, um, and to figure out ways to create structure, in a when you're dealing with, it's easier with one-to-one students to have structure when you're online because just focusing on what they need. But when you're dealing with a group situation, which is so much more dynamic and which invites students not just to be passive learners that are engaging with the teacher and maybe answering a few questions, but they need prompting generally. In a group environment, you're kind of passing that over to them to facilitate the conversation and to build on each other and to become more active learners and to support each other and to ask questions that they may not think of for themselves. So, as a teacher, as an instructor, that that opens all sorts of new questions about how do you keep things communally built while maintaining tailored focus. And it's something I'm always challenging myself to bring in new ideas to help to engage the students differently.
I want you to expand on how your current course helps your students develop their mindset.
Well, right now, I teach a range of different levels in my business. I have some students that are 13 plus and some students that are undergraduate, postgraduate level. So I have a very broad range, and I like that range. It leaves things very flexible. But for the teacher project, my focus is on building specific strands for GCSE and A-level English language and literature students. And that has been such a joyful and interactive experience. I think, especially looking at my A-level students, I have a small group of 3 right now, and they are critically questioning and reading and writing at, at a very in a very curious, I guess you could say, level. They're willing to let themselves be pushed deeper. They're willing to allow themselves to be uncomfortable in front of each other and to really push ideas and the purpose behind what writers are doing further than they have in their classrooms. And they tell me that they go into their classrooms, into discussions, feeling a lot more prepared because of the way that they're able to link context and text, not just here's some context for this text, but this is how this context is informing this text and how it's shaping what the writer is doing and how it's contributing to the writer's purpose. And those links are making them start to think about their own writing, right? So if they're writing an essay about Hamlet, for example, right? They're looking at how Shakespeare is using his language to achieve specific effects, right? To communicate something about his characters. They're also suddenly thinking about how they are shaping what they're writing for their audience, which is the
Mm.
examiner, and how they're thinking about, the assessment objectives. What do I need to include? They're starting to see themselves as writers, not just as readers, and to understand that writing isn't just about recording everything they've been taught and memorized and thought about a particular text or extract, but it's actually itself an act of creation, even if it is reflecting on another creation.
No, it's very interesting because I've always believed that shifting energy comes from two major forces, what you consume and what you create.
Mhm.
And I think oftentimes when students think about like doing an exam, they're always thinking about, I'm trying to give what they want me to consume instead of seeing their ability to create and to create in a deep way. Um, do you think this process of them going from understanding from a reader, having the tools and techniques to become a empowered writer influences their mindset and their character as a whole?
Absolutely. I think they become more confident and more willing to see themselves as story writers, as shapers. They're shaping their own stories in their own lives, right? As much as they are reading about other people's stories. Um, it's very easy to accept the canon as these are the important writers society says we need to know. But to start to reflect on why are these particular people chosen to be included in the canon, and who has been left out and why? And has that canon shifted over time? And if so, then who's to say that this experimental work that I have on the side or that I've been exposed to or that I heard someone talk about or that I picked up at a secondhand bookstore isn't also going to, in some way, be incorporated at some point when there is a necessity for it by social concerns. New conversations are being had constantly, depending on history, society, what's happening in the world, with politics, with religion, with everything, with who we are, with how we identify, with our changing environment. Um, so new stories are always going to be necessary, even though they might have the same archetypal features.
I want to keep expanding on the conversation of the present context of the world. And when you look at the world in 2025 and you see your students go through it, as a leader, as an influencer of these young minds, what concerns do you have about the modern world and its impact on these kids' mindsets?
I mean, this is almost a trick question. Yes, I could say the modern world is very busy. We don't have time to think, to just gestate and be. But really, isn't that the same age-old question that even someone in the 1400s would have had? How the young are not doing what they need to be doing or not experiencing what they need to be experiencing based on what the people who've been there have done, right? Um,
In concept
so
of progress, are you talking about and how things progress? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, is it I mean, yes, progress, but no progress, because history repeats itself, right? If you go back to, 1470s, the printing press, right? You have text suddenly being printed, whereas before they were handwritten. How does that change the way education is? And oh gosh, the world is going to change now. What do we do? Um, how's that? Yes, it is different, but at the same time, there's congruencies to be made here with the digital age coming in, right? I don't see the digital replacing the printed so much, right? I don't think that's going to happen, but what do I know? We could see, right? History will tell. Um, but I think regardless of the generation, whether it's now 2025, 1925, 1825, that same question could be asked and the answer would probably be the same.
It's interesting. I find in this day and age, there's opportunities for concern and opportunities for excitement.
Absolutely.
And the reason why my concern is when I was growing up, we had 6 TV stations. The news would have half an hour, 30 minutes. And in that 30 minutes, you would have world events, local events, weather, entertainment, sports. And it was basically just like, this is what's facts coming at you, right? And it was seemed that the journalists had to have some form of training or understanding for them to deliver the news. But what I felt was they weren't telling us what to think of the news, right? They were telling us
Mhm.
the news. And then you would take of it and you would interpret it however you want. What I find happening now is you're getting so much interpretations coming at you because if you have a phone,
Yeah,
if you have a computer, you're an anchor, right? You have a voice that can reach millions of people.
of
And I,
course.
and I
In
feel that there's such this wave of energy and information and perspectives and consumption and facts and alternative facts that I get concerned is it coming at a speed, and not just speed, but from diverse angles,
Mhm.
from Twitter, from television, from their parents, from everywhere? Do they have enough filter to be able to take sense from nonsense?
Probably not, right? I agree with you. There's a saturation of over inundation of information for young people to learn how to filter. And some of that is artificial and some of it is biased, as you say. I'm not sure news was ever unbiased, right? Any story is going to have its biases,
For sure, I'll have his twist.
right? But it's a different type of challenge. It's not one that I think is necessarily a lost cause, but we need to, as a society, kind of think about how we want to teach people to filter that. I think it's in flux right now, right? Universities and schools are still dealing with how to accommodate for AI coming in, right? What does that do for marking papers, especially in English? A lot of educator friends of mine know that they're spending hours marking papers that are AI generated, and they still need to comment on them if there isn't, proof of that. So it's really it's really right now, I think, still forming and creating what it will become.
Yeah, the AI is another totally different angle.
Yeah.
The other day I was working at a literature class. I teach literature as well for a group of students, and it's clearly written by AI, right? So when I started discussing the content, not the writing structure or the mechanics of the writing, but just the content, she didn't master the content. Like she couldn't talk to her own content. And that's when we kind of discussed and said, listen, I understand this balance that you're trying to find,
Yeah.
but I'm asking for your opinion,
Yeah.
right? But
It's
AI is out there.
Yeah, but if the students are going to AI to begin with, then that shows that they're not always confident enough in their own voice yet.
Correct.
So also exposes the work we as educators need to do to
Absolutely.
teach them to trust their own voice over the voice of AI, and not just AI, but over the voice of others, right? To trust your intuition and your story and your authentic voice and your vulnerabilities. And that's very difficult to do. It's easier said than done. But the the turn towards it is also, I think, partly the result of this overwhelm and busyness that we are all engaged in. We don't have the time to stop and think sometimes because we're just trying to keep our heads above water. Um, so are we creating the problem as well as trying to deal with it?
And I think that goes back to our discussion about the book.
Hmm.
Because I think a book allows you to kind of have that level of stillness where you can start creating that self-awareness, where you start creating the filter that you will process your world in, or how you navigate your world. Um, when I asked somebody else, another interview that I conducted, Dwayne, he talked about creating a filter,
Hmm.
right? Understanding yourself well enough that you have a filter to be able to navigate the world and to keep yourself in mind, your focus on what you need to achieve, and understanding what comes in and what comes out, and what is useful towards your needs and what isn't.
Prioritizing. But that becomes complicated because we all have different personas depending on our contexts.
Correct.
So our filters are going to need to change for different contexts. And that becomes very nuanced.
Very nuanced. Um, Sherry, I'm going to leave you with this. We've had a great conversation, standing lots of nice wide variety of issues. What advice would you give a young person today? Young could be young in anything that they're doing, young in their career, young in a marriage, young at a situation, young in age. What advice would you give them from your experience on how to navigate the modern world?
So really, it's what advice would I give anybody? Because we're all young at heart in some way, right? I'm not sure that I am in a position to give advice on life because I myself am experiencing it and learning from it. But I would say that for me, as well as everyone else, to learn how to stay curious, imaginative, whimsical, and trusting your own voice is really the challenge of life. Trusting your own intuition and speaking your own story, right? Create it and speak it. Trust yourself to do that instead of taking on the structures and expectations of others. Pick
Thank you.
what you want.
That was beautifully well said, Sherry. Thank you so much. The first half of the year, my focus is on mindsets with this interview series. The second half of the year, after July, if you'd like to come back, we're going to be talking about habits. So you have an open invitation if you want to come back, and we can have another powerful mindset interview.
Thank you.
Sherry,
That's what's
thank you
fun.
so much for your time. This was a wonderful learning experience, and I'm sure people are going to enjoy it. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Appreciate that. Thank you for all your comments.